Jerry, you look pretty small back there. So do you. I've been amazed over the years. I've handed many a small child a set of binoculars, and they've seen me use them. These are 7 by 35, pretty good for bird watching, not very good for stars. But invariably, the child will turn around and everything looks pretty small. Now, when you turn it around this way, I can tell the button that's not buttoned. And I can see a lot of things with that way. In the last year, I've been noticing something as I study the Bible. Those of you that are members here, those of you that are about to become members here, welcome, first of all. We're glad you're here. Those of you that are guests and came in late, thank you for coming. This is God's family, and we'll do what we can to make you feel at home. But I've noticed in our Bible reading, we read at least 4 or 5 chapters every night. In the morning, we read from the Sabbath school lesson and the testimonies. And all of this, I've noticed something. Most of the time when God's people get in trouble, it's because God's too small for them. Where am I going with that? Let's go back to the original parents, Adam and Eve in the garden. Satan didn't come as a great dragon. He came as a beautiful serpent, and he did something unusual. And then he said, "Has God said?" And the reason that he did that was to create doubt. Have you ever doubted yourself? Ever been driving down the road and you know that you're supposed to get somewheres and you know you're supposed to turn someplace and you've been busy driving and talking and all of a sudden you're not sure where you're at and you're not sure if you've gone past that place or if you have not gotten there yet? Ever been there? I've been there lots of times. Sat down one day and figured the number of cars we had owned and the mileage that we had disposed of each car. And it comes to over 2 million miles that we've driven in the time that I've been driving. By the way, Barb taught me to drive. I grew up in the city. There was no need to drive. There was a bus close by. My family was large, like Steve's family. And I was the oldest. And I got quite proficient at walking. We walked everywhere. Didn't have a lot of money, so we walked barefoot. 110 degrees outside, walked across the pavement, across the 4 lanes of road with my bare feet, no problems at all. The calluses were that thick. Walked across goat heads. I don't know, I've not seen them down here. We have them in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma. They have 3 points on them, and they are about 1/4 of an inch long. No matter how they sit, you're going to catch one of those points sitting straight up. And only if it hit the inside arch of my foot would I ever feel them. But this, as I began driving, I began seeing myself doubting my abilities. Anybody here think that there are a few nuts on the road? And they haven't found the bolt that they're supposed to be attached to? They do. When my children were young and beginning to drive, I said, plan on them doing the most ridiculously stupid thing you can imagine, and they won't surprise you. And by and large, over those 2 million miles, that's exactly what I've seen. We are first introduced to Satan's temptations through doubt. Am I supposed to look through which end of this? Is it the right end? My phone now has the ability to be used as somewhat of a microscope and somewhat of a telescope. And it depends if you hit the right button that you get the right direction and get to where you're wanting to be. Adam and Eve doubted God. Eve doubted that God had done the best for her. Adam doubted that God could create another woman for him. No woman could ever be as good as the woman that he had. And so he gave up everything for her. Abraham and Sarah doubted God. We're in our 90s. I have friends that are here today that are in their 90s. I don't suppose the husband ever looks at the wife and says, God told me you're going to get pregnant next year. She'd look at him and say, and you're stupid. It's not going to happen. And so Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah had this debate, and God came back and said, at this time next year, and they still couldn't believe it, and they had a handmaid that was a surrogate wife. That's what I call her anyway. The Bible calls her a concubine. And she had a child, and that proved to be disastrous. And we're still reaping the benefits or the curse of that today. Abraham's grandson had 12 sons. And when one of the sons says, God came to me and gave me a dream, and this is what's going to happen. The 11 stars and the sun and the moon are going to bow at my feet. They said, no, it couldn't happen. That's nothing that God can do. This doubt is an essential ingredient in every temptation that Satan brings to us. And it's always a doubt of, is God big enough? And so I introduced the subject, is your God too small? When the car breaks down, is your God too small to fix it? Some of you know our air conditioner went out on the car, went to the auto shop, and they said it's $2,000 to fix it. I talked to my son. He said, Dad, do you have $500? I can get the air conditioner, and I can put it on, and I'll charge you another $200. I can tell you $700 is a whole lot easier to find than several thousand. Is God big enough to handle those issues? When the throwout bearing goes out in your transmission, and it's just a little bearing, but it's right in between the motor and the engine, the transmission, is God big enough or small enough to get in there and replace it? When a storm comes along and the tents are destroyed, and I've been there, we've had our tent, the only one that's standing. My daughter and her first cousin were in a tent when a tornado hit it. Is your God big enough to handle a tornado going over the tent that your daughter and your niece are in? He is. It bent two of the poles, and it went across the top of our barn, removed the lightning rods, went down through a pasture behind us and cleared out trees. But the only thing it did is twist a pole on our tent. We've had a tent set up through 20 inches of rain and not a drop came inside. We're camped on the top of a mountain, not top, but close to, above 10,000 feet. My wife comes in, wakes us up. That morning when we got ready to eat breakfast, it was raining. And I opened the tent door and a cloud floats in. Any of you ever have a cloud float into your tent? It was wet. I was surprised it was wet until I realized that's where the rain falls from. And that afternoon, after we'd eaten lunch, we laid down and took a nap. And Barb came in and she woke us up and she said, Big Thompson Dam just broke. It was just one mountain over from us. The whole valley was washed away. People who were given 5 minutes to get out. It's going to happen. You need to leave now. But they had their binoculars turned in the wrong direction. Satan, I find, does two things with doubt. One is he lets us doubt that the problem that we have is as big as we think it is. And the second one is he has us think that God is too small to handle the big problem that he's created. I admire Job. I admire him because he says, even though he slays me, I will trust him. I really enjoyed Pathfinder Camporee. By the way, Pathfinder Camporee did not come without a large price. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent in getting those kids there, in getting the whole program put up. Was it worth it? Are you sure? 1,100 baptisms. 1,100 baptisms and almost 300 yet to be baptized. So we're talking almost 1,500 baptisms from a camporee. Was it worth it? Is suffering a storm that twisted up tents, that soaked blankets, is it worth it? Wherever God's people try to go and do something great in His name, Satan comes in like a vicious lion. And he wants us to doubt. I have good friends, family members of mine that said there was too much money spent, there wasn't enough medical personnel there, and they went through this long list of things, and then I'm sitting and seeing almost 1,500 baptisms. What would you pay for an evangelistic effort here in Myrtle Beach for 100 baptisms? What is the cost? What is the price of one soul? How big is God? Ray Price in 1956 wrote a song, How Big is God? And in that he says, how big and wide His vast domain. To try and tell these lips can only start. He's big enough to rule this mighty universe, yet small enough to live in my heart. I heard that song sung a lot when I was closer to the 50s. Now that it's 24, very few people even remember the words. Though men may strive to go beyond the reach of space, to crawl beyond the distant stars, this world's a room so small within my Master's house. I love science fiction. I don't know if any of you do here. I'm not a Trekkie, but I love it because many times what the science fiction artist sees is what becomes reality 20, 30 years down the road. Within one science fiction story, there is a group of people called the Borg, and they travel in a ship that is a perfect cube. And it's many miles on each side of that cube. Where do you think they got that idea? I have a promise, John 14, 1-3. In my Father's house there are what? And if it were not so, I would have. There's a room there. And I love the black minister who said, and above the door of the house is a name. It's yours. But you can choose not to live there. I've seen people who have inherited homes and chose not to live there. Do you doubt that there's a room there with your name on? If it's a condo, will it make any difference? If you're on the 5,000th floor, will it make any difference? I think, as a childhood friend of mine said, we're going to inherit telescopic and microscopic vision. Adam named everything animate and inanimate. I don't understand what God has planned for us, but His promises are large. Do we believe? Now, is doubt a sin? John the Baptist, Jesus said there's none greater, right? That was his estimation of John the Baptist. There's none greater than. And John was the one who stood in the Jordan's waters and said, behold the Lamb of God. That does what? Takes away the sin of the world. Is that a pretty large God? I mean, the sins of the world, can you imagine? They say now the population of earth equals the total number of people that have lived prior to us. So 16, 20 billion people. The Lamb of God takes away the sins of 16, 20 billion people. Is that a pretty big God? That's a huge God. But John the Baptist, after he had sat in prison a while, and God had not sent his son to deliver him, there had not been an answer to his prayer, he says to his disciples, go ask that man Jesus, are you the one? Are you the one? Is that doubt? It is. The righteous can doubt. It's what we do with our doubts that makes it sinful or not. Doubt can lead two different directions. Doubt can take us to the promises of God where we are safe and saved. Doubt can take us to disappointment and disobedience. Depends on which way you want to go on that line of faith. Do you doubt God? And I'd love to say I never doubted God, but I think even this week I did. Matter of fact, I'm sure I did. I doubted God this morning when I was on the way to church, and I said, do I really want to present this sermon? I doubted that you would understand what I'm trying to say. The psalmist said, thy word I have, that I might not. How many verses did you memorize this week? If we're really going to go through a time of trouble such as man has never seen, and we're going to live by the promises of God, shouldn't we be memorizing those promises? Shouldn't we? Now, I've heard about 4 people say amen, and I know there's more than 4 people on the front row. If we're going to go through a time of trouble such as never was, shouldn't we be memorizing God's promises? Oh, and shouldn't we rely on Him? I learned a new phrase this week, and I'm not sure, some of my folks who have studied Hebrew may correct my pronunciation. I knew that God was eternal. Did you? I knew He was unchanging. Did you? I knew that He was all-powerful. How about you? I still only hear 4 or 5 people. I knew that He was everywhere present and that He would never leave me. That's better. I knew that He was all-knowing. He knows what I need today and what I will need tomorrow. I knew that He was truth. There is no sin or lie in Him. I knew that He had loving kindness for each of us. I knew He was full of grace and mercy. Oh, the amens are getting weaker again. I knew that He was merciful to me. I knew that He had forgiven me. And I knew that He was Shomar Habrit. And that bothered me because I don't read that language. I don't know that language, so I had to look it up. It is covenant keeper. My God is a covenant keeper. There are 7,000 promises within the Bible. I've never counted them. I'm taking somebody else's word for it. They could be mistaken, and I may be mistaken in sharing that number. They also said 1,000 of those are to those that are wicked, that have rejected God. There's 1,000 promises to the wicked, and none of them's good. None of them are good. But there's 6,000 promises for God's children. I challenge you this week to find 10. Just 10. I mean, it's easy. If you want to go for 20, you have 10 toes. But find 10 to 20 promises and write them out on 3x5 cards and begin to memorize them. That's what I'm going to be doing. So if you want to join me, I would challenge you to do that, because it's in knowing God's promises. When Satan came to Jesus in the wilderness following his baptism, he said, "If thou be the Son of God." A little doubt in there? Was he trying to stir up a little doubt? If thou be the first elder, if thou be the pastor, if thou be a church member, if thou hast said you have been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. Satan loves to do that. Oh, you did it again. I thought you asked God to forgive you of that. I thought you asked God to remake you. There's a phrase that I learned in academy. Those of you not familiar with that word, we're using it with all of our church schools now. But this was a boarding academy. I got to go 2 years. When I left at the end of the second year, I owed all of 1 year. And I had to spend 2 years paying that debt off. But I will never, ever think that the cost of that money, the cost of that education was not worth it. I have dear, dear friends of mine after 60 years. And when we get together, it's as if we had never been apart. I can't say that with any of my non-Adventist friends, but I can say it about those people that I spent 2 years with. Not all of them are Adventists, but the phrase that I learned is it is not the occasional good deed or misdeed, but the trend of the heart. What is the trend of your heart? Is it doubtful? Then I ask you to go back and look at this all-powerful God. This God who stood on nothing because there was nothing to stand on. This God who spoke to no one because there was no one to speak to. This God who said, "Let there be," and it became. I get excited about that because when he says, "Let there be grass," is there only one kind of grass? Down here I found all kinds of grass. When he said, "Let there be flying insects," did he create only one kind? Did he identify every kind he was going to create? Or did his imagination come to life? What is God's imagination for you? What is his biggest dream for you? What does he see you doing for him? Can you imagine that end of that first month in heaven, God says, "Hey, Nancy, I've got a place for you to go see and tell them about how great I am and how horrible sin is." Can you imagine that kind of conversation? When God says sin will never arise a second time, I believe it's because of people like you sitting in this congregation today. It's people like you who have had Satan knock at your doors and say, "If thou art really saved, you wouldn't act like this." And you look and say, "But he died for me, and he is remaking me." Anybody here remodeled a house? Does it happen in one day? It can take a long time. And the funny part about it is when a house is remodeled and you're done and you look a week later and you say, "I wished I had," right? If I were doing it again, I would have. God will not do that. I'm convinced that the troubles that I'm going through are for the unseen, unfallen beings around us. Are you safe to go to heaven today? If you've trusted in Jesus, you are. Joe and I were talking here a while back. His father made a statement in a sermon, and I failed to bring it with me. Satan is angry because we will replace the fallen angels. The righteous of this earth will take the place of those evil angels that left. And I never realized how many angels left heaven. How many fell for his sophisticacy in heaven? Half. Half. If you take 100 and half fell, that's 50. A third is 33, so there's 17 angels that didn't get expelled from heaven but fell for his sophisticacy. But they accepted the promises of God, and we're told that even Lucifer, if he had repented, he would eventually have been restored to his position. That's grace beyond my imagination. If I came into the church school as a 10-year-old and I said, you know, I don't want to be here, I'm not going to obey your rules, there's no way, and I have an outburst every day in class, sooner or later they're going to throw me out of the school, right? Sooner or later it's going to happen. But then take me back the next year with my promise that I won't do that. Which side of the telescope are you looking at God through? Is he big enough? Hey, hello there, Steve. Or has he become too small to handle the problem you have? This last week, I had a problem, rather large problem. We have 2 key fobs to the car. We bought it with one. This is the one that we bought the car with. We ordered one offline. A friend of mine reprogrammed it. Battery went dead and it quit working. But this one was lost. And we looked through the car, looked between the seats, under the seats. We looked through everything we could think of, every place we could think of, and we could not find it. And we said, Lord, you know where it is. Bring it to our attention when we need it. Did we need it when we weren't going anywhere? And we couldn't find it. But I had a medical appointment, and I needed this key fob. We went to do laundry, and we pulled the sheets out of the bottom of the basket, and there was a pair of shorts beneath a bunch of sheets. Now, I had gone through everything down to the sheets, thinking that was the first thing we threw in the basket. But in that pair of shorts was my key. My God was big enough to find my keys for me. You found God big enough. So how do we stop looking at this God so that he's too small? I'm going to give you some clues that I've found. One is sing. I don't sing great, but I love to sing. And guess what? You don't have to know every word that you're singing. If you sing the first bar and you can't remember what the second one is, hum it. Hum it loud. Satan doesn't love it when you're focusing on God. But sing. Sing loud. And if somebody says you don't sing well, say, join me. Do it better than I can. The second one is make sure you're spending 30 minutes or more within your Bible every day. It is where God talks to you. It's where he answers your life's perplexities. Spend at least 30 minutes every day. Third one, and I almost mentioned it first, is spend time on your knees. Even if your knees hurt like Steve's and mine. In my private prayers, I pray long prayers. In my public prayers, I try to pray short prayers because children can't stay focused that long. And guess what? With what society has done to us, a lot of you can't either. A lot of you become disassociated, disaffected, and your minds are thinking about other things if that prayer is long. But pray. Spend time praying. What is the biggest killer of marriages? Oh, nobody's going to tell me. How many of you think it's lack of communication? If you're going to live with somebody, you ought to talk with them, shouldn't you? Now, I have a problem. I took my hearing aids out because they refocus my voice and I get distracted with it. But I don't hear as well as I used to hear. And you can ask Barbara and she'll say, yeah, that's true. The other day she said something while I was writing something on the computer and I tossed her a red pen and she said, I didn't ask for a red pen. And a lady online said, I asked him what he was going to do next, and he said, I do not have a hairy chest. Your Father wants to hear from you. Those of you that have children that live a distance from you, and the phone rings and you know it's them, do you ever want them to quit talking? If they talk for an hour, is it too long? If they take 2 hours, is it too long? No. Now, if it's somebody calling up and said, I want to talk to you about Medicare, most of you are looking at me and saying, yeah, I do the same thing. But your God, your Father, wants to hear from you. If you're going to live forever with Him, and He's going to talk to you face to face, shouldn't you get to know Him? Shouldn't He get to know you? He's already known you because He's omniscient, right? All-knowing. He knew what Eric was going to do before Eric did it. He knew what Joy was going to do before she got married. He's all-knowing, but He wants to hear from you. Your voice is precious to Him. He wants to hear from you. And you can't tire Him out. And not one of your prayers is ridiculous. The little child who sits there and babbles and babbles and babbles is precious to our ears, right? Have an 18-month-old or a 10-month-old or whatever, and they're beginning to talk. Their talk might not make any sense, but as they learn to talk with you and they get older, they start sharing more and more things. I know how proud I was of my oldest son when he called and he said, Dad, I'm looking at buying a house and I need your advice. That's pretty special. And God is that proud of hearing you. So, singing and prayer. And the third thing is memorizing promises. And I've challenged you to memorize how many? 3 people answered. I've challenged you to memorize how many this coming week? Now, if you're like me, my mind doesn't memorize that well, and I can talk louder than that child, so don't worry about that. A church without children is a dying church. And a church without children that are boisterous or noisy is a church that is a mortuary. I want to hear children. I want to be the church that the unchurched love to come to. It's a new phrase that I have enjoyed. Be the church that the unchurched love to come to. Be the Christian that unchurched love to be with. A good friend of mine calls himself an atheist, and he loves to argue with Christians about creation. I happen to believe that in 7 literal days, 24-hour days, God stood on nothing and spoke to nothing, and He said, let there be. And at the end of the 7th day, He said everything was very good. I believe that. He doesn't. And I looked at him one day and I said, you know, John, I think it takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian. And he looks at me and he said, you're the first Christian to admit that. And I said, I have more faith in someone than in nothing. And he said, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. Don't worry. Isaiah 49, verse 13 to 16 was read this morning. Turn back to it. Isaiah 49, verses 13 to 16. I'm going to give you a little time to get there. I'm sorry, this is not the one that was read. I apologize. Alex, I really appreciated you reading for me. Isaiah 49, starting in verse 13 and going to verse 16. Don't worry, look up at the sky and down at the earth. The sky will disappear like smoke. The earth will wear out like a well-used garment. Every last thing will perish and dissolve. But I always look for the buts, Norman. They tell me that everything in front of that was unimportant, unimportant, or they tell me that everything following that is more important. So I look for the but. But, say it again, louder. My salvation is for all time. My justice will not end. Have you forgotten me, the one who made you and the whole world, who stretched out the skies and made sure the earth's foundations? Yet you constantly worry about others, how they hate and might harm you, but their anger counts for nothing. In an instant, those who cower in fear and trepidation will be free to go in confidence. They won't die in the chains or suffer from hunger, because I, the Eternal, am your God. I can make the oceans boil with steam and roll with great waves. They call me the Eternal Commander of heavenly armies. I've given you my words to speak, protected you with the shadow of my hand. I am the one who pulleth the skies tight, made the earth rock solid. I am the same who said to Zion, you are mine. You are mine. Can you see the bride and groom standing in front of the church? And the groom turns to the bride and he says, you are mine today. But the covenant-keeping God says, you are mine forever. Will you doubt him? Will you look through the wrong end and find that your God is too small? Or will you rejoice in song, in prayer, in scripture reading, in memorizing promises, and find that God's larger than anything you've ever imagined? That's his question of you today.